Greetings, friends. This video will be audio and pictures instead of me visually. I'll continue appearing in most of my videos because I like giving each video a personal touch, but those videos take a lot longer to produce, so I thought I'd take a short break from that method. I imagine some people will hit the thumbs down as soon as they see the title of this video. Well, for approximately the first 25 years of my life, I believed in racism too, so I can kind of sympathize, even though I think you should still hear me out. Before I explain why racism isn't real, let me tell you a bit about myself for those that don't already know. My best friend is a Ghanaian man. I've spent many months living in Ghana. I've also spent months living in Tanzania, India, and Peru, where I volunteered with different NGOs among other countries where I just traveled or studied Spanish in Guatemala. I've spent a lot of time studying Spanish, actually, in different countries. I studied French, not so much, just in Canada. But I spent a lot of time studying one of Ghana's languages, known as Ewe, for the reason that I was immersed over there. But for 2 years, I co-directed a language school in Toronto, teaching English to working-class immigrants, mostly from Latin America. And my former business partner in that venture was a Colombian guy. And I live in a part of Toronto still today where whites are only about 15% of the population. Now, I shouldn't have to tell you all this. I know. I don't mean to bore some of you. I shouldn't have to justify myself for saying that racism is a fiction. People who agree with me shouldn't need the same cultural immersion I've had to arrive at the same conclusion. But I figured at least some people might be more willing to listen to me if they knew my background. The term racism itself is completely slippery and convoluted. I'll discuss that later in the second half of this video, but first I have to discuss the history of this term. Racism is a communist idea designed to produce hatred and chaos, and it has accomplished exactly what its creators intended. The term racism was created and popularized by Soviet intellectuals in the 1920s, but it was Leon Trotsky who was the main force in propagating the term after 1930, when he published his book, The History of the Russian Revolution. Born a Jew in present-day Ukraine, Trotsky's original name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. When he was in his early 20s, he changed his name to Leon Trotsky in order to sound more Russian. In 1922, not long after taking power, the new Soviet government issued a decree that made anti-Semitism a crime in Russia, even punishable by death. Trotsky had a direct role in creating this law. Indeed, there was rising anti-Semitism in Russia at this time. Ordinary Russians were coming to see that leading Soviet government officials were largely Jews, and the membership of the secret police and execution squads were also heavily Jewish. The idea of racism was originally used to demonize Slavs who were proud of their own race and culture and who didn't see themselves as equal to other peoples. Communism was expanding and absorbing different peoples at this time. The leaders called themselves internationalists, and they were hostile to nationalism. Just like the globalists today, the communists wanted to destroy the concept of unique races and cultures so they could control us. If you stood up for your own people, you were labeled a racist. Better that all humans were identical blobs of silly putty. Of course, they celebrated the identity of the poor peoples to mobilize them against the wealthy European peoples. But make no mistake, the end result is that even the poor peoples will have their identity destroyed. The real winner of the Second World War was communism. As soon as the conflict ended, Marxist intellectuals began infiltrating Western universities, and they began teaching critical theory, as it was known, and still is known. My own aunt teaches critical theory at a college in California. The aim of this infiltration was to destroy Westerners' unique sense of themselves, to demoralize their faith in their own culture and history. Americans like Joseph McCarthy and Ronald Reagan tried to warn us of this subversion during the 1950s, but they were ridiculed. Sure enough, by the 1960s, the seeds of this communist subversion were flowering. America was becoming more democratic. Democracy only functions in a homogeneous culture where successful, hardworking men are the only voters. It's not something that has been going on in that form for much of history. Usually the king would be calling most of the shots, or better, a series of lords. This democratic process, which did work well for a few centuries, had already been undermined in the late 19th century by socialist movements, although they may not have been using that exact name at the time, but it was essentially the same thing. And these movements expanded the franchise to all men, regardless of whether they owned property and whether they had a real stake in society. Then, in the early 20th century, the voting franchise was expanded to women. Once women got the vote, it guaranteed that communism would spread to the West. People who think socialism and communism are distinct don't understand that the former is simply a more subtle way of accomplishing the same end: redistribution of resources from the wealthy to the poor. Look at Venezuela. It's nominally socialist today, but it's effectively communist. And like every other example of full-fledged communism ever attempted, Venezuela has produced nothing but misery. The Scandinavian socialist states today only survive because they spend wealth that was acquired decades ago under capitalism, while they continue to allow some degree of capitalism. As I said, when women got the vote, it was a fatal step building on decades of serious mistakes. Women naturally vote for bigger government and welfare. It's their biological imperative. And it's no fault of their own. The fault rested with the weak men who pissed away all the hard-earned liberties of their forefathers. Related to this expansion of the franchise was continuing immigration. Pioneers and settlers are not immigrants. Immigrants are those who come to an established country. This can proceed smoothly if the immigrants come from a common culture, in this case the Protestant British Isles and certain other Northern European countries. It's true that immigrants played valuable economic roles, such as in building railways. The filthy crony capitalists like the cheap labor, and the socialists like the easy votes. But this flood of immigrants caused democracy to eventually fail the white Protestants, the ones who had established America and English Canada. These countries were now becoming more racially and culturally diverse. In January 1961, John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency. Though he was white, he was also the first Catholic president. I don't mean to antagonize Catholics. My own Canadian grandmother was from an Irish background, which was probably Catholic. I don't really know, to be honest. But her family already had settled in Canada long before she was born, and she married a man of English descent. So most people from a white Catholic background assimilated to Canadian and American society. At the same time, they did change the culture to some degree. They represented another element deeply interwoven with a new fabric of society. Especially Southern Europeans, like the Italians, who were more likely to create their own ethnic neighborhoods in the cities of the 19th and early 20th century. And yes, most of the Italians assimilated. Two of my close friends growing up or being in university were from an Italian background. And at the same time, though the Little Italies have mostly been replaced by other ethnic groups, there is still some Italian culture, even after 50 years or more. And there's even, some of the original immigrants didn't even learn English. The rest, like some of the women didn't learn English, but it just goes to show you that even when you have immigrants coming just from Europe, even then there's going to be challenges at assimilation. Like I talk of how this part of the city is completely not flooded with Portuguese, but they are clearly like this dominant group. This is something that the Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck would have appreciated. When he successfully unified Germany in the late 19th century, he made sure not to include Austria-Hungary in the new German state. Austria was predominantly Catholic, and though there were many Catholics in Germany, it was predominantly Protestant. Bismarck knew that in order for a culture to stay strong, it needed to have as much religious cohesion as possible. He also tried to limit Catholic influence in high circles, apparently without much success, though in 1872 he succeeded in prohibiting Jesuit institutions in the German Empire. Now let us return to America in the 1960s. Maybe because JFK was aware of his cultural difference from the Protestant Americans, or maybe simply because he was young, he was the first president to begin using the term racism, as far as I can tell, which further helped to normalize it. The 60s was a time when white Protestant Americans began being taught that they were guilty for their own past, despite the fact that they had created the most successful country in all of human history. If you don't believe that America and other Western countries offered and continue to offer the best standard of living in the world, well, ask yourself, why is it all the world wants to come to these countries? To be oppressed? Well, that makes no sense. Now, at the same time in the 60s, Native Americans, previously viewed as sometimes noble and sometimes brutal savages, but savages all the same, now came to be seen as victims of oppression. A similar switch of thinking occurred towards blacks, along with the beginning of money transfers from whites to blacks in the form of affirmative action, welfare, and other government programs. As for Canada, by the 1970s, English Canadians were being taught to feel guilty for dominating the French-speaking, predominantly Catholic province of Quebec, or Quebec. I don't know why I say it Quebec, maybe because I've been exposed a bit studying some French, even though I studied Parisian French. But anyways, though the Quebecois, or Quebecers, were of European origin, they were used as pawns by Pierre Trudeau's Liberal Party to declare Canada a bilingual country where English and French are both official languages, despite the fact that the French language is only dominant in one province, Quebec. And yes, there are French speakers in New Brunswick and parts of the Maritimes, but basically it's Quebec. They should probably just separate. That would be great for them and for us. In communism, in this type of thinking, there's always going to be a winner and a loser in certain terms of certain power. Like there's a government hierarchy now where if you need to get to the top positions in any ministry or head of the military or top government positions, especially the leadership of the country, you got to be bilingual. It's not like it's virtually a necessity, virtually. So that obviously leads to certain groups of people benefiting from the system. Not to say that each group or the other necessarily originally set out with that intention to transfer power. That seems to be, that's how it plays out, and that's why it can increase tensions and misunderstandings between these peoples in the framework of racism and past oppression. I mean, come on. I mean, yeah, the English conquered French Canada. Basically, what? The army was 2/3 Americans or half Americans. The rest was British. This is back in like 1759. And General James Wolfe, you know, he died in the battle, but they won the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. They conquered Quebec City. And that was like when there were like 60,000 French Canadians at that time, 60 or 70,000, and then maybe like 7 million English speakers. This is a settlement that was limited to the very eastern part of Canada and along the St. Lawrence Valley mostly. It was nothing like the Canada today. The settlers and the pioneers who expanded Canada from what is now Ontario westward, that was all, well, I mean, there were the Eastern Europeans later on. I'm not going to deny that in the 19th century, but the framework, the basic thing was established by English Canadians, originally loyalists who came over during and immediately after the American Revolution. So you can say that Canada was kind of two nations, but clearly English is the dominant language, the same way that English is the dominant world language. Not all of this is actually in the script of my video. I read the script and then it kind of inspires me to go off on these tangents. French Canadians, they were used by the Liberal Party under Pierre Trudeau, who had a very many years in power. And then that official policy of biculturalism, of Canada being like fundamentally a French-English nation, country, That soon springboarded into official multiculturalism. Again, to get originally votes from Ukrainians, I believe, and then one thing led to another, and then you had Pakistan and India today. I don't think Pierre Trudeau ever actually imagined that that's what was going to end up happening. He was asked in the late 90s, not long before he died, I think walking through Toronto or something, like, did you envision this? And he's like, well, no. I don't know in those words, but you could say English Canadians had their culture fractured even earlier than Americans. And today, Pierre Trudeau's son, Justin, also Prime Minister of Canada, has declared the country a post-national state with no core identity. That's virtually the words he used. Canadians who deny this are called racists by the media, by academia, by government officials. These accusers seem to forget the origin of the term nation is birth, meaning your own bloodline, your own people. Some might extend that to say, oh, your customs, your shared way of life. But, effectively in practice, it's your own birth, your own family and kin and tribe. The word racism entered our vocabulary not from interacting with friends and family, but primarily from the public school system and from the media. Though perhaps we are so brainwashed today that liberal parents do teach their children this word. The point is that it was a top-down indoctrination, not an organic process. The indoctrination has been so successful that even people who oppose Marxism, who oppose socialism, use the word racist. For example, they talk of the racism of the Obama administration towards whites, or the racism of the South African government towards whites. In doing so, these conservatives, or libertarians, or whoever they are, not on the left, they also unconsciously justify the communist narrative that racism is a real thing. And this is one of the reasons I don't use the word anymore. Now that we've gotten the history out of the way, let's look at the term racism itself. The most accepted definition of a racist is someone who hates another person based on that person's race. If this were all that racism implied, I would begrudgingly admit that it has a place in our language. Although it is still problematic, nobody wants to think of themselves as someone who hates. However, the fact is that we all hate to some degree. Indeed, it is sinful to have hate in one's heart, and may God forgive us. But that doesn't change the fact that hatred towards those who are different is, at least to some extent, part of the human condition. We all have in-groups and out-groups. We are tribal. The problem is that the idea of racism heightens hatred between groups. It takes normal resentment and makes it boil by giving it ideological justification. Yet, as evidence of the convoluted, slippery nature of the term racism, there is a second definition of a racist, a definition which is arguably just as popular. This is someone who discriminates against or in favor of certain races. For example, it can mean closing their country's borders to particular groups while admitting others. This discrimination may or may not be the result of hatred. It is taken by socialists that the act of discrimination is evidence of hatred. But that isn't necessarily true. Discrimination is a normal, healthy process. Only over the course of the last 60 years did it take on this negativity. The fundamental meaning of discrimination is to differentiate, to recognize differences between people, between things, between anything. Not only is it part of the human condition to discriminate, it is entirely healthy and moral. If a motorist cannot discriminate between a red light and a green light, they're in danger of being in an accident and putting others in danger. The same goes for people. Like it or not, race exists. It doesn't matter whether you place more emphasis on biology or on culture. The fact is that we belong to different groups with different abilities. For example, Bantu origin Africans simply make ideal runners and jumpers, and that's because of their genes. Of course, I'm speaking in terms of averages. The same can be said for race and IQ. Ashkenazi Jews have the highest average IQ, and they're followed by East Asians. This is called race realism, which, unlike racism, refers to empirical reality. Likewise, we are told not to stereotype, but stereotypes exist for the same reason. They may not reflect the truth of each individual, but they do reflect general truths, or they never would have formed in the first place. Look at Japan and South Korea. They are something like 98% ethnically homogeneous. It's very difficult to immigrate to these countries and virtually impossible for a foreigner to obtain citizenship there. Though China has a tiny bit more diversity, the situation is essentially the same when it comes to foreigners. Actually, the vast majority of countries in the world heavily exclude foreigners from establishing themselves in their countries permanently. I mentioned the East Asian countries because they're relatively developed economies compared to the world as a whole. And though Japan may sometimes be called racist by the global media, it's not something we hear very often. Why is that? It's because the agenda is to destroy the West, so only white nations are said to be racist. The truth is that the white nations are the most open and tolerant societies on Earth. Nobody has opened their borders the way we have. And still, they call us racist. It just goes to show how ridiculous the idea of racism is, how it is merely used as a weapon against us. And if you try to play their game and say you're not racist, you'll never win. Having lived in Ghana longer than any other country apart from Canada, I like Ghana. The people treat me in so many ways which I like. They are very friendly and hospitable. And they also treated me in some ways that I didn't like. In the past, I referred to this as racism in an attempt to show the socialists that racism is not what they think it is. But I'm smarter now, and I don't play that game. Of course, there is discrimination against me in Africa. After all, I was basically the only white person living in a town of 50,000 Africans. Do you honestly think discrimination would not occur in that circumstance? People shouted at me whenever they saw me as though I was a strange animal. Again and again, there was they call me Yavu or Yavo. I've talked about that before. On its own may be an innocent word. It could mean pig or dog. It depends on the context. Whatever people's intentions are, they are shouting it at me thousands of times. You are a strange animal there. And it would kind of start to drive me insane. Apart from that, there was the reality that taxi drivers or local businesses would sometimes charge me much higher prices than locals would have to pay. Now, socialist ideology would convince some people in the West and it would convince some Africans, well, I mean, it's their right to discriminate against me because even though they've defined racism as discrimination, well, there were these perceived injustices in the past. And the British Empire wasn't perfect, but most of this perceived injustices is a myth. And I just don't have time to go into debunking that myth here. But suffice to say that Ghana wouldn't even exist without the British Empire. Like any other sub-Saharan country, it would be a collection of tribal kingdoms with 17th century technology. Some Africans have been affected by socialist ideology today, but most of them have not. But regardless of whether the socialism got into their heads, they do discriminate, naturally, against strangers, and especially against white people, at least in certain ways. There can be positive discrimination, there can be negative discrimination. Discrimination is simply differentiating, behaving slightly differently to different peoples. A large number of Africans think whites come from a land where money grows on trees, and so it's only natural for these Africans to try and get as much as they can from a white person. When Paul and I were building the house in Ghana, I couldn't show my face whenever Paul went to buy materials from local businessmen. If they understood that Paul and I were business partners, they would raise the prices to such a ridiculous level that we wouldn't even be able to buy anything. And yet, despite all of what I've just told you, none of that is racism. Yes, I mean it. It's simply natural in-group preference mixed with ignorance and a certain immorality. And don't say, oh no, that's the same thing as racism. It is not the same thing. Neither am I saying that all Africans are immoral. Like I said, I like Ghanaians. If I didn't, I never would have spent so much time in their country. I'm just saying you can find this sort of behavior practically anywhere in the world when local people interact with a stranger. I don't get angry about it. Effectively, everyone on Earth is racist in different levels. Let me say that again. Everyone on Earth has a smidgen of racism in them. It's unescapable. And this is just another reason why racism is a senseless word. It's like calling someone a devil. The only shallow sense the word possesses is as a means of tarnishing your reputation. A racist person is a bad person. A statement that obliterates the fact that it may or may not be true. Very cleverly designed indoctrination. Once people get exposed to socialism, the middling and lower intellect people who've been carrying on as they have for a long time, not particularly angry, now start to get angrier. And particularly when they have to deal with people from different groups. Naturally difficult tendencies for different groups interacting with each other now become fraught with higher tension. We can observe this in South Africa, for example. The liberals of today who insist that they are not racist do not live amongst different races. I don't think it's much of a stretch to say this is the general pattern. They live in their nice condos and suburbs. And it's true that these suburbs and condos have some diversity, but everyone belongs to the same economic class. So this is not a true experience of diversity. That one black or brown or Asian college friend you have doesn't really show you what it's like to live in an African society, an Indian society, or an Asian society. Now, something liberals have trouble with is the reality that certain races tend to perform economically better than other races. And this is a matter of nature, or in other words, it's a matter of no racism holding anyone down or benefiting anyone. Liberals also claim not to see color, and yet they encourage certain groups to immigrate to the West and receive welfare at the expense of other groups. And that directly negates their statement that they don't see color. Of course they see color. Even if a liberal strives to treat all races equally, they still think so-called racist thoughts. In other words, they stereotype groups. They avoid certain people on the street. They have particular emotional reactions when they encounter certain groups. Can you imagine Justin Trudeau hanging out at a bingo hall in a working class area of Toronto? No, neither can I. And bingo halls, as I've seen them, tend to be pretty diverse. But they're usually populated by working class people, or as I can attest, by people lower than the working class. The inevitable reaction we all have is not always because of skin color. It could be a person's clothing, their manner of speech, whether they seem to be on drugs, etc. But all of us, liberals included, have stereotypes in our heads. As we already discussed, it's natural and healthy for us to discriminate, though a good person is usually willing to listen to someone from an outgroup. In other words, consider what the stereotype teaches you, but don't let it govern the way you behave with all humans. What I fault liberals for is their intellectual dishonesty, their denial of the obvious. I can't prove what goes on in their heads, but their actions betray their feelings. As mentioned, they claim to love diversity, but they're the first ones to move out of diverse areas. They encourage mass immigration, even though it causes a brain drain from third world countries. Furthermore, from what I understand, scientific studies have shown that liberals are far less likely to be respectful towards other races when dealing with them face to face. Unlike conservatives, liberals tend to think of certain groups as children, forever disadvantaged. Here's a clip of a YouTuber known as Vladimir Yaffa talking with a white liberal man about black Americans.
Let me It just kind of tells you.
Yes.
They had to live with their slavery after the slaves were free.
Right.
They had to wear it on their face. They had to wear it on their skin.
Exactly.
Yes.
Can't get out of it.
Yes.
And living with it.
So,
And it was too easy for people to draw the line at color.
This is today.
And that's the problem.
okay.
But not even, but
You
Now-
don't
let me
have, when your children lose that accent, got a little accent. When your children lose that accent, you're as white and you're as free as anyone has been.
Right.
But they have to carry the color.
What could be more disparaging than that? Is the irony lost on this guy? Of course, we are going to recognize who is white and black, and we're going to discriminate to some degree. But to say that someone continues in slavery because of their skin color is incredibly condescending. Only Marxist doublethink is capable of this. Hasta luego, amigos.